November 15th, 1955, 11:42 p.m. 125th Street was alive with Friday night energy when Captain Michael Clean Slate O'Brien stepped out of his patrol car. The new head of the 28th Precinct had been on the job for exactly 73 days, and tonight he was going to make his statement. Bumpy Johnson was standing outside Minton's Playhouse, talking quietly with three city councilmen about a housing development deal. He wore his signature charcoal suit, hands clasped behind his back, looking like any other businessman conducting evening affairs. But Captain O'Brien saw something different. He saw the king of Harlem, and he was about to dethrone him in front of 200 witnesses. O'Brien had brought 6 officers with him, full tactical gear, handcuffs ready, the works. This wasn't going to be a quiet arrest. This was going to be a show. The kind of show that sent a message to every hustler, policy runner, and street soldier in Harlem. The new sheriff was in town, and nobody was untouchable anymore. Bumpy noticed the approaching officers before anyone else. His eyes tracked their movement, counted their numbers, assessed their intentions. But he didn't move, didn't warn the councilmen, didn't signal his own security who were positioned strategically around the block. He just continued his conversation about zoning permits and construction contracts as if 6 armed police weren't walking directly toward him. "Ellsworth Johnson," O'Brien called out, his voice carrying across the street. "You're under arrest." The music from Minton's seemed to stop. Conversations died mid-sentence. 200 people on 125th Street turned to watch what everybody knew was impossible. Nobody arrested Bumpy Johnson on his own street. Bumpy turned slowly, looked at O'Brien with those calm, calculating eyes that had stared down Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello. "On what charge, Captain?" "Conspiracy to operate an illegal gambling enterprise." O'Brien stepped closer, handcuffs already in his hand. "Hands behind your back." The 3 councilmen stepped away, suddenly very interested in the sidewalk beneath their feet. Bumpy's security detail tensed, hands moving toward their waistbands. One word from Bumpy, and 125th Street would become a battlefield. But Bumpy raised his hand slightly, a gesture so small only his people would notice. "Stand down." To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Captain Michael O'Brien was and why he thought he could do what no police captain had ever done before. Take down Bumpy Johnson. O'Brien was a 15-year veteran of the NYPD, transferred from the Lower East Side, where he'd built a reputation as the one honest cop in a sea of corruption. No bribes, no deals, no looking the other way. When the commissioner needed someone to clean up Harlem, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated, O'Brien was the obvious choice. His first day in Harlem had been August 3rd, 1955. He'd walked into the 28th Precinct expecting to find the same corruption he'd fought downtown. What he found was something different, something more complex. The officers weren't taking money from criminals. They were taking advice from community leaders. They weren't breaking the law. They were bending it in ways that kept families together and violence off the streets. Sergeant Martinez, a 20-year veteran, had tried to explain it to him. "Captain, this neighborhood runs on relationships. You got to understand who the real power brokers are. It's not just about badges and guns." But O'Brien had dismissed it as cop talk for corruption. He'd implemented new procedures: 0 tolerance for gambling operations, mandatory arrest for policy violations, by-the-book policing with no exceptions. Within 2 weeks, crime had actually increased. Street fights, domestic violence, petty theft. It was as if removing the informal structure had created a vacuum that uglier forces were rushing to fill. O'Brien couldn't understand it. He was doing everything right by the manual, but Harlem was getting more dangerous, not safer. But O'Brien had made one crucial mistake. He thought Harlem worked like every other neighborhood in New York. He thought the rules were the same. He thought muscle and badges were enough. What O'Brien didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson didn't control Harlem through fear or violence. He controlled it through information, through loyalty, and through a network of debts and favors that ran deeper than the subway tunnels beneath the street. 3 months earlier, August 1955, O'Brien had gotten his first taste of how things worked in Bumpy's domain. A routine domestic violence call had led to the arrest of Thomas O'Brien, a 22-year-old construction worker with a gambling problem and a tendency to hit his wife when he lost money he didn't have. Thomas O'Brien was also Captain O'Brien's youngest son. The gambling had started small, $5 bets on baseball games with his construction crew. But Thomas had that particular weakness that turns small bets into big problems. He chased losses. A $5 loss became a $20 bet to win it back. 20 became 50. 50 became hundreds. By July, Thomas owed $8,000 to 3 different operations. The legitimate bookies had cut him off. The loan sharks were getting impatient. That's when desperation made him stupid. He started taking police equipment from his father's precinct. Radio batteries, handcuffs, even a service revolver. Selling them to fences who asked no questions and paid cash on the spot. Bumpy's people had noticed the equipment showing up in the wrong hands within days. In Bumpy's world, nothing moved through Harlem without him knowing about it, especially police equipment that could be used against his people. Julius, the librarian Washington, one of Bumpy's most trusted associates, had brought the information to him on a Tuesday afternoon. "We got police gear floating around the streets," traced it back to a construction worker named Thomas O'Brien. Bumpy had raised an eyebrow. "O'Brien, like the new captain?" "His youngest boy. Got a gambling problem and a marriage problem, both getting worse by the day." Most crime bosses would have seen opportunity. Blackmail material against a police captain was worth its weight in gold. But Bumpy had looked at the situation differently. The father know about any of this? Doesn't seem like it. Kids covering his tracks, but not very well. Bumpy had made a decision that would have surprised anyone who thought they understood how power worked in Harlem. Fix it. Fix it how? Fix the gambling problem. Fix the marriage problem. Fix it so the father never has to know he had problems to begin with. Within 48 hours, Thomas O'Brien's debts had been quietly transferred to Bumpy's books and marked as forgiven. The young man never knew who paid them off. He was simply told by a counselor at a community center that he'd been selected for a special program for gambling addiction. Free counseling, financial planning, marriage guidance, all sponsored by anonymous community benefactors. The arrest report never made it to the captain's desk. The domestic violence charges were quietly dropped. The wife was relocated to a safe apartment in Brooklyn with 6 months' rent paid in advance, and Thomas O'Brien was enrolled in a gambling addiction program that coincidentally was funded by several Harlem community organizations that received regular donations from anonymous benefactors. Captain O'Brien never knew about any of it. He never knew that his son owed $8,000 to Bumpy Johnson's policy banks. Never knew that Thomas had been selling police equipment to pay his debts. Never knew that Bumpy could have destroyed both father and son with a single phone call, but chose instead to solve the problem quietly, the way problems got solved in Harlem when Bumpy Johnson was involved. What Captain O'Brien did know was that crime statistics in Harlem had mysteriously dropped 23% since his son started attending those community meetings. What he didn't know was why. Back on 125th Street, Bumpy placed his hands behind his back without resistance. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Captain O'Brien attached the handcuffs. The click of metal on metal echoed like a gunshot in the November night. For the first time in 20 years, Bumpy Johnson was in police custody on his own street. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Old-timers who remembered when Dutch Schultz's men used to terrorize the neighborhood shook their heads in disbelief. Young hustlers pulled out cameras, knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. A woman in a fur coat whispered to her companion, "This can't be happening." Not here. Not to him. But what struck Captain O'Brien most was what didn't happen. No one rushed to Bumpy's defense. No one shouted threats or protests. The crowd simply watched, quiet and expectant, as if they knew something he didn't. As if they were waiting for a punchline to a joke only they understood. O'Brien felt the weight of those watching eyes, felt the collective judgment of a community that had accepted his authority for months but never really trusted it. Tonight, he was proving their suspicions correct, or so he thought. "You have the right to remain silent," O'Brien began, but Bumpy interrupted. "I know my rights, Captain." His voice was calm, almost conversational. "Question is, do you know yours?" O'Brien ignored the comment and began walking Bumpy toward the patrol car. The crowd followed at a distance, murmuring, whispering, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Some pulled out cameras, others just stared. Everyone knew they were watching history, though none of them knew what kind. As they reached the patrol car, O'Brien opened the back door. This was the moment, the visual that would be in tomorrow's newspapers. The moment that would show all of Harlem that the new captain couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be stopped. He could already see the headlines. Honest cop takes down Harlem kingpin. But something felt wrong. Bumpy was too calm, too cooperative. In 15 years of police work, O'Brien had arrested hundreds of men. Fear, anger, desperation, resignation. He knew all the emotions that crossed a criminal's face when the handcuffs went on. What he saw in Bumpy's eyes was none of those things. What he saw was patience, as if Bumpy was waiting for something. Bumpy paused at the car door, turned slightly toward O'Brien, and spoke just loud enough for the captain to hear. 6 words. 6 words that made O'Brien's blood run cold. "Tommy's doing much better now." O'Brien's hand froze on the door handle. His face went pale. His eyes locked onto Bumpy's calm, knowing smile. In that instant, O'Brien understood 3 things simultaneously. First, Bumpy Johnson knew about his son. Second, Bumpy Johnson had been protecting his son for months. And third, Bumpy Johnson had let himself be arrested in public so that O'Brien would understand exactly who controlled what in Harlem. The captain's hands were shaking as he unlocked the handcuffs. He tried to keep his voice steady, professional, but the words came out like broken glass. "There's been a misunderstanding. You're free to go, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy rubbed his wrist where the metal had been, straightened his suit jacket, and looked at O'Brien with something that wasn't quite pity but was close. "Captain, would you walk with me for a moment?" It wasn't a request. O'Brien nodded to his officers to wait by the car and followed Bumpy down the sidewalk, away from the crowd. When they were out of earshot, Bumpy stopped and turned to face him. "Your son is a good kid," Bumpy said quietly. "Made some bad choices, but he's learning. Those community meetings are helping. The counseling is helping. His wife is safe, and she's thinking about taking him back if he keeps improving." O'Brien's jaw worked soundlessly. Finally he managed, "How long have you known?" "Since the first day you arrived in Harlem, Michael. Can I call you Michael?" Bumpy didn't wait for an answer. "You see, the thing about being a captain is that people tell you what they think you want to hear. The thing about being me is that people tell me what I need to know." A car drove by, slowing down so the occupants could stare at the unprecedented sight of Bumpy Johnson having a calm conversation with the police captain who just arrested him. Bumpy waved at the car like he was greeting neighbors. "Your son owes me money," Bumpy continued. "Not anymore, I paid his debts." But he did. He also stole police radio equipment to pay gambling losses, sold it to some very unsavory people who I had to convince to return it quietly. Tommy never knew I was involved, and neither did you. Until now. O'Brien found his voice. "What do you want?" "Nothing you weren't already doing. Keep being an honest cop. Keep fighting corruption. Keep making Harlem a safer place for families like yours and mine. Just remember that honest doesn't mean stupid, and safe doesn't mean at war with the people who've been keeping the peace since before you got here." Bumpy pulled out an envelope and handed it to O'Brien. "Tommy's graduation certificate from the addiction program. He finished 2 weeks ago, top of his class. His counselor says he's ready to rebuild his marriage and his life." O'Brien opened the envelope, saw his son's name on an official certificate he'd never known existed, and felt something inside him break and rebuild simultaneously. "I don't understand." "You understand perfectly," Bumpy said. "You're just realizing that the world is more complicated than they taught you at the academy. Good men make bad choices. Bad situations create good opportunities. And sometimes the people you think are your enemies are the ones watching your back when you don't even know you need protection." The crowd on 125th Street was starting to disperse, realizing that whatever had happened was over, and there wasn't going to be any violence or drama. Just 2 men talking like they'd known each other for years. "What happens now?" O'Brien asked. "Now you go back to being the best police captain Harlem has seen in 20 years. You clean up the real corruption, the kind that hurts families and destroys communities. You work with community leaders, all of them, to make this neighborhood better. And when you have problems you can't solve through official channels, you remember that some of us have been solving problems in Harlem since before official channels existed. Bumpy started walking back toward Minton's playhouse, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Michael, next time you want to arrest me, call first. We can probably find a way to handle it that doesn't require handcuffs and an audience, unless you prefer the theatrical approach." Captain O'Brien stood on 125th Street for a long time after Bumpy disappeared into the club. He looked at the certificate in his hands, thought about his son, thought about the arrest that had turned into something he couldn't quite name, but understood completely. The next morning, O'Brien called a meeting with his officers. He announced a new approach to community policing in Harlem: more collaboration with local leaders, more focus on violent crime and less on victimless offenses, more understanding that keeping the peace sometimes meant working with people who operated outside official channels but inside community trust. The crime statistics that had been dropping for months continued to fall. Officer morale improved. Community relations reached levels that hadn't been seen since before the Depression, and Captain Michael O'Brien became known as the most effective police captain in Harlem's history. He never arrested Bumpy Johnson again. He never needed to, because both men understood something that took most people years to learn. Real power isn't about who can put handcuffs on whom. Real power is about who chooses to take them off. 3 years later, at Thomas O'Brien's wedding to his reconciled wife, a large envelope arrived at the reception. No return address. Inside was a cashier's check for $5,000 and a note. "For the happy couple's future, congratulations from a friend of the family." Captain O'Brien never asked where the money came from. He didn't need to. Some gifts come with an understanding attached, and some understandings are more valuable than explanations. The story of the night Bumpy Johnson let himself be arrested spread through Harlem like wildfire. Not because of the handcuffs, but because of what came after. People talked about the calm conversation, the respectful release, the way two powerful men found a way to coexist without destroying each other. And Captain O'Brien learned what every other authority figure in Harlem eventually learned. You don't defeat Bumpy Johnson by fighting him. You defeat your problems by working with him. Because in Harlem, respect wasn't about who wore the badge. It was about who wore it responsibly. That's how a police arrest turned into a partnership. That's how handcuffs became a handshake. And that's why, when people tell stories about real power in Harlem, they don't talk about who had the guns. They talk about who had the wisdom to know when not to use them.